Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to cast this aluminium slingshot using lost foam casting. I cast this slingshot at home with no really advanced tools or equipment, and the only power tools which I used to make this slingshot were a drill. The casting method that I used for casting this slingshot is lost foam casting, and my source of aluminium for this slingshot was lots of old aluminium cans and some scrap that I had lying about. This photo shows all of my cast slingshots which I've cast in the past in chronological order, and I think you'll agree that they get better as they go along, with my first casting slingshot being pretty much a complete fail, and then my second one being out of proportion, and my third one not being a very ergonomic shape. I definitely think that this new Rambone slingshot which I've cast is by far the best. As you've seen in the previous photo, it took 4 attempts to get to this stage, so don't worry if your first attempt at casting doesn't come out great. To make this slingshot I had to have a lot of fails, as you'll see later on in the video. So casting slingshots is by no means an easy way of making a slingshot, but when it works I think the results are really great, so let's see how you make it. In my last casting video, I accidentally created a thermite reaction inside my crucible. That reached temperatures of up to 4,000 degrees, and it melted a hole in the crucible and then destroyed the bottom of my forge, so I had to both buy a new crucible and repair my forge. If you want to see the full video explaining how I accidentally created this reaction in my crucible, then click on the link in the description down below. So the first thing that I had to do was repair the big hole in the bottom of my forge, because obviously I can't be having that. And to do that I use a 50-50 mix of plaster of Paris and sand. This 50-50 combo, when used as a thick coating around the edge of my forge, makes a good fireproof lining, and it also lasts a really long time. So the next step of the process is to create the foam mold which is going to be used for the casting. In another video I experimented with using different types of foam, and I found out that polystyrene foam works best, and this polystyrene is just used from an old box which actually came as packaging for my new sander, and this piece of foam is quite thick. Now you need to go to the link in the description, which will take you to joerg Sprave's Rambone slingshot files, and that's the slingshot design which I'm going to be using, and you can use whatever slingshot design you like, but I would highly recommend joerg Sprave's Rambone slingshot designs. Then once you've done that, cut it out and draw it onto the foam. The next step is just to use a hacksaw blade, which is no longer in the hacksaw, to cut around the shape of the slingshot in the foam, and it's really easy to cut it out with the hacksaw blade because it's quite sharp, and because the foam's really soft you can cut corners really easily. Next I take a normal metalworking file and I've refined the shape of the slingshot to exactly how I'd like it to look. Next I need to refine the shape of the slingshot so that it's nice to hold, and I always like to start with the palm swell, and I'm just shaping the slingshot like I would with any other slingshot, and it's really important that you're careful when you do this, because any imperfections in the foam mold and they'll be amplified loads of times into the aluminium, and you'll find that it's a lot harder to get imperfections out of aluminium than it is out of foam. Once all the profiles and curves are filed into the foam mold, I'm then going to start using sandpaper just to round all of the edges and shape it. And I spent 3 hours in total on this slingshot mold, just making sure that there were no divots or bumps in it, so that when I cast the slingshot mold then it'll look really nice and I won't have very much filing to do in the aluminium. This is what the mold should look like once you finish with it, and as you can see it's really smooth. Once the mold's all finished up, now you need to prepare it for the casting, and for this I'm just going to be using some fine sand, and I'm going to fill up a pot a little bit so that there's a layer of sand on the bottom, and then I'm going to put the foam mold upside down in the sand and start to bury it, and I'm making sure to compact the sand into all of the little gaps in the mold. Also remember that the sand that I'm using here is very fine kiln dried sand, and the drier and the finer that your sand is, the better it'll be, but you can just use sand off the beach. I've I've also added the bottom half of a steel can over the end of the mould with a little bit of the foam poking out of the sand, so that when I pour the aluminium it will all be funneled down into the mould and none of it will splash out. Now it's time to get all of my equipment ready for casting. This is all the stuff which you're going to need for the melting and casting part of this process. So first, obviously, you're going to need your forge, and this is just a coal forge which I've made by myself, and you can use a commercially made forge or a propane forge or whatever will heat up the aluminium hot enough to its melting point. The forge is also powered by an air blower. Next, you're going to need a crucible, and this is just a 2 kilogram crucible made of graphite, which I've bought off the internet, and I would highly recommend it because it will last for many castings. And you can also use a steel can if you're using a low powered forge, and steel cans are just the ones that you get off food, but you need to be careful to change them over very regularly because it's really easy to burn holes in the bottom of it. I've also bought some crucible tongs just so that it's easier to handle the graphite crucible. For safety, I've got some fireproof gloves to protect me from the heat and some safety goggles to protect me from any sparks. I've also got a fire extinguisher with me, and I definitely recommend having a fire extinguisher. Now it's time to light your forge and get it going. Once it gets hot enough, you need to put in the crucible full of the aluminium. I like to bury my crucible down into the coals of the fire so that it heats up evenly and any aluminium inside it will heat up really quickly. As I said before, my source of aluminium for this project is just going to be aluminium cans, and I just crush them up with a hammer so that they're really small, and the smaller that you crush them up the better, because then less oxide will form and then there'll be less slag, and then you'll get more aluminium for the amount of cans that you put in. I also just use a pair of pliers to help me scrape some of the slag out of the top. Now the crucible is almost completely full of molten aluminium and I'm about to pour it. I tightly hold my crucible in my new crucible tongs and I go to pour the aluminium into the mould, and finally all of my work on the mould and the slingshot is about to pay off and I'm about to have an aluminium mould. But no. I'm not really quite sure what happened here, but whatever happened, it completely ruined the mould, and it is because there wasn't enough aluminium left in the crucible, because half of the crucible was completely filled up with just oxide and slag from the cans, and then when I poured it, only the real aluminium came out, and the oxide and slag was just left inside the crucible. And then I think this happened because I'd let my crucible completely fill up with all of the aluminium, and then I'd let it completely cool back down again, and then I'd reheated it, but then I'd let it cool back down again while I was getting the mould prepared, and then when I reheated it again, then I tried to pour it, and I think the reason that this happened was because each time that I reheated it, somehow more oxide and slag was formed. Unfortunately, because of this, I've completely ruined the mould, which I spent 3 hours making, so I decided to make another mould, but I just rushed it completely and there was a lot of imperfections left in the mould and I didn't spend much time sanding it down. So since I wasted most of the aluminium in slag, I then decided to melt down most of the rest of the cans which I had, and also some scrap aluminium which I got for free from the scrapyard. In the future, once I melt down the aluminium, I'm going to cast it into ingots before I melt it down in my graphite crucible, so then all of the slag won't be left in the graphite crucible. Now I've managed to get out about half of the slag, so that only about a quarter of the crucible is filled with slag from the bottom, and I'm going to have to find a better way of getting it out than just scraping it out with a metal stick. Now I've filled the crucible also completely filled with molten aluminium, and I've cleared most of the slag from the top. I'm just going to try and cast it for the second time today. The way that this casting process works is when you pour the aluminium into the foam mould, the foam is completely disintegrated by the extreme temperatures of the molten metal, and then as the foam disintegrates, some of the sand around it is hardened by the foam fumes, and then the aluminium falls into the mould and takes the place of the foam. And then once it's all cooled down enough and it's solid, you can pour some water on it, and then you can take it out and it turns into a full aluminium shape of whatever your foam was. Unfortunately, because there was still some oxide inside the crucible at the bottom when I poured the mold, the entire crucible wasn't filled up with aluminium, so that when I poured it into the mold, not the very end of the handle was turned into aluminium, so that was just left as air, and I'll have to replace that with something else. Unfortunately, because there was a lot of imperfections in the mold because I rushed it, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time with files just to get all of the deep scratches and bumps out of the mold. And if I'd spent as much time on this mold as I had with the original mold, which was ruined, then the slingshot cast would be a lot more accurate. I've decided that for the hilt of the slingshot on the very bottom of the handle, I'm going to start by using some homemade micarta for it, and this micarta is some homemade micarta made of black and white paper, and if you want to know what micarta is and how to make it, click the link in the description down below for my full how-to tutorial, which is going to be up next week. The first step of shaping the slingshot is to start the bottom of the hilt, and I just need to flatten it out with files first, and luckily because this aluminium is cast aluminium, it's really easy to shape because it's quite soft. Next I use a normal power drill just to drill a 3.5mm hole deep down into the handle of the slingshot. I'm using a nail as a pin and it can just slot into the handle like this. I've now cut out a piece of the paper micarta which is going to act as the hilt, and I'm using my drill press just to drill a vertical hole going straight through the middle of it. I then draw around the bottom of the handle onto some 1mm thick brass which I'm going to use as a spacer. I cut out the shape in the brass using a hacksaw, and then I use my power drill just to drill a hole straight through the middle for the pin. Once that's all done, all of the pieces can line up just like this. I've clamped up the slingshot in the vise, and I've got all of the pieces covered in a 2-part epoxy. A couple of hours later and the epoxy resin glue has hardened, and now I can start shaping all of the hilt. Make sure that if you're using micarta on any of the slingshot that you wear a dust mask while shaping it and sanding it, because it can create really bad fumes and dusts which you don't want to get in your lungs. I've then glued on some more paper micarta on either side just to thicken the bottom of the handle, and now I've also glued on some denim micarta just to make the curve at the end of the slingshot. I mainly use rasps to shape the micarta, and then metal files just to shape all of the metal. And for the metal, I'm just going to be filing it flat until I get all of it down to bare aluminium, and hopefully I won't leave any imperfections or scratches in the aluminium. This is what the hilt looks like once I've finished shaping it. Now I'm taking a lot of time to take all of the scratches and imperfections out of the aluminium, because otherwise the slingshot would look really bad, and this is probably the most time consuming process of this casting, because the files always get clogged up with bits of aluminium that I can scrape off with a wire brush, but it's still really annoying. It's also really hard keeping the shape symmetrical, because sometimes you've got to file quite a lot out of one side just so that you can get all of the scratches out of it, and then that means that you've got to file that exact same amount out of the other side even if there are no scratches in it. And if I don't do that, then the slingshot won't be proportioned properly and it'll look rubbish. And I probably spent around 4 hours just filing out all of the different scratches in the handle. Next time I'm definitely going to spend quite a lot of more time on the mold, and I maybe even might give a go at green sand casting. As I file the slingshot, I'm also perfecting the shape completely, because I want the final shape of the slingshot to be just like the shape of which I'm filing out now. Eventually, after countless hours of exhausting filing, I finally managed to see the slingshot start to come into shape, and I've got all of the deep scratches out which I can really be bothered to get out. Now comes the process of sanding the slingshot all the way up to mirror finish. Unfortunately, this process takes a really long time, and sometimes it can become really boring and frustrating. To speed up the process, I'm using sanding sponges, which I find works a lot better than just using normal sandpaper, because for starters they don't wear out as quickly, and also they can do curves on something like a slingshot much better, as well as making the edges much smoother than if you use just normal sandpaper. I bought these sanding sponges in a pack of 20 for £4 off eBay, so they're really cheap, and I find that they're much cheaper and last a lot longer than just normal sandpaper. I start with the 80 grit sanding sponge, and I'm just going to be using it to get any deep scratches out of the entire of the slingshot, and I'm going to go over the whole slingshot before I move on to the next grit, because otherwise I'll sand some parts up, and then as I'm sanding other parts up, then that part which I've sanded up earlier will get scratched, and that can be really annoying. This is what the slingshot looks like once I've finished sanding all of the aluminium up to 80 grit. I'm now going to move my way up using different grits of the sanding sponges all the way up until I get my 400 grit sanding sponge. Once I'm at my 400 grit sanding sponge, I'm then going to use some light sandpaper until I get all the way up to 600 grit. Once I'm up to 600 grit, I'm going to use my worn down 800 grit sanding sponge to finish off the polish on the slingshot. Notice that in my vise I've got some wooden vise jaws, and that'll just help protect the aluminium from getting scratched by the metal. When I move on to my 800 grit sanding sponge, I take the slingshot out the vise because it's much easier just to hold it. I spent at least an hour and a half just using the sanding sponge on the whole of the slingshot to try and bring it up to a very high finish. The slingshot's now quite shiny, but it's not good enough, so I'm going to go over it with some metal polish, rubbing it on with just a normal cloth. The longer that you spend applying the metal polish with your cloth, the shinier the slingshot will become, and you can also use a buffing wheel, but not many people have that, and I don't have one either, so I'm not going to be using one. After almost an hour and a bit using the metal polish, the slingshot is finally finished, and as you can see there's a really nice mirror finish going over the whole of the slingshot. Now I've attached some double layered tapered TheraBand gold, which are target shooting slingshot bands, and if you don't know how to make slingshot bands, then I've got a full how-to tutorial on my channel. And the ammo which I'm going to be using out of this slingshot is going to be some M12 hex nuts and some 20mm marbles. I start off by just firing some of the M12 hex nuts at the cardboard box. They've got quite a lot of impact, but because of their strange shape, they don't have very good penetration, so let's move on to the 20mm marbles. I find that these fly much better and they hit with quite a lot more impact, as well as having much better penetration against the cardboard. Quite a lot of people ask me what I do the slow motion footage with, and I'm just using a GoPro Hero 3 Black, and it's filming at 240 frames a second. So thanks for watching guys, I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I've definitely enjoyed making it, and I put so many hours of work into the editing and creation of this video, as well as the creation of this slingshot, and I put a lot of effort just to make the full how-to tutorial, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button down below, and also subscribe to my channel for more casting videos and videos on general other homemade weapons. Also, if you have any other suggestions for anything else that you'd like me to make, just send me a personal message with your idea.